Today we're going to look at the pawns, and we're going to see the importance of the pawns, and then talk about how you should think about playing your pawns during the game. So first we're going to talk about how much the pawns are worth. Each piece in chess has a measurement of how important they are. And the pawns are worth, everything is based on points or pawns. So a pawn is worth, as you can imagine, one pawn or 1 point, depending on how someone's talking about it. At the beginning they are the weakest piece on the board, but later on in the game they can become very valuable. They can promote, which we'll get into later, meaning that if they reach the other side of the board, the last rank, they can turn into any piece they want. They can turn into a queen, they can turn into a bishop, a knight, a rook. The only piece they can't turn into, as you can imagine, the king. They can't turn into a king. But there's two goals. At the beginning of a game, when you move your pawn, you should have two goals in mind. You should move your pawns to gain center control, and the second is you should have king safety. So you want to keep the pawns in front of the king to have king safety. Now let's get into the movement. The movement of the pawns is on the very first and only the first move that they make. They can move 1 or they can move 2 squares. Once they move, so if I move to E3 on my first move, my next move I can't move 2 spaces. I can only move 1 space forward. And if I move 2 spaces, it doesn't matter. My next move can only be 1 space forward. If I move any pawn, it can only move forward 1 space. But on the very first move of the pawn, it can be 2 spaces forward. It can be 2 or 1. It depends on how you want. Also know that the pawn is the only piece that cannot move backwards. So all your other pieces can move forward, backwards, side to side. It doesn't matter. The pawn can only move forward. So always keep that in mind. So you don't want to overextend your pawns in certain situations because they can't come back. And you can have a lot of space between your pawns and your pieces, and a lot of times it's very hard to defend all your pawns in that situation. So let's go ahead and talk about how it captures. The pawn is the only piece that captures differently than how it moves. The pawn moves forward, only forward, but it captures diagonally. So let's say black pawn is right here. We capture diagonally right here. If there was a black pawn on D5, our white pawn actually can't move. There's no piece for it to capture on C5 or E5, which are the only possible capturing squares, and he can't capture forward. So in this position, our pawn on D4 has 0 moves. Now let's say we move our pawn to E4. This black pawn, he can't. There's no piece for him to capture on C4. He can't capture on D4. He can capture on E4 because he can capture diagonally. So that is how the pawn captures. Now there's one other way that a pawn can capture that I'm going to go over right now, and that is en passant. And that is if you have a pawn on the 5th rank, and it would be the 4th rank for black. What you can do is, if your opponent if you're on the 5th rank, if your opponent moves 2 spaces, and it has to be 2 spaces, then on your next turn, and only on your next turn, you can capture, called en passant, and you can actually move from here and capture this pawn. You actually don't end up on the square that you capture the pawn. Now let's say black moved his pawn to C5 and you moved your knight, and then let's say black moved his knight to F6. You can no longer capture on C6. You only have that one turn to do it. And also keep in mind, let's say the black pawn was on E6 and you move up and black moves his pawn to E5. He only moved it up once, so in this case you cannot capture this pawn. The only time you can capture is if he moves up 2 spaces, his very first move, and you're on the 5th rank. Only on your next turn can you move to C6, and it could be depending on where it is, but you would basically move 1 space behind him. You're still capturing diagonally, but you're not ending up on the square that the pawn was. So that is how a pawn captures. Now the last thing I want to go over is what you can do to promote. And promote basically means that you have your pawn on then he moves to the last square. So let's take a look at it. If let's say we have our pawn on c7, if he can get to c8, he can turn into any piece you want. So if you want to get another queen, that's completely fine. If you want to move and you want to get a knight, you can, which is very valuable later in the game. You could have a king and a pawn versus a king, and it may look like it's completely hopeless, but if you promote your pawn to a queen, well, now you have a queen and a king versus a king, and you're going to have a very easy win. So early on, you want your pawns to have center control, and you want them to protect your king. Later on in the game, you want them obviously to support your pieces, but you also want to, if you can, promote your pawns so they can become more powerful pieces. So this is how the pawn works. Hopefully this has helped in your game, and you can use this in the future.